The cold was no longer just a feeling, it was a warning. Evelina stood ankle-deep in the freezing mud of the Derbyshire woods, her satin slippers ruined and her chest aching from the effort of suppressing her shivers. She knew she should run for shelter, but the fear of returning to Arabella without the lavender was sharper than the wind. "Just one more sprig," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "If I go back empty-handed, she will lock the door." A crack of thunder shook the ground, followed immediately by the heavy, rhythmic pounding of hooves. She spun around, just as a massive black shape burst through the tree line, a nightmare of muscle and speed charging straight for her. "Oh," she gasped, stumbling back into the brush. The rider pulled the reins hard. The stallion reared, its front hooves slashing the air inches from her face before slamming down with a ground-shaking thud. "Easy," the rider commanded the beast, his voice deep and vibrating with control. He sat high above her, silhouetted against the dying light like a dark storm cloud. He looked down, his eyes the color of a frozen lake, staring directly into hers with an intensity that sucked the air from her lungs. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough with stunned confusion. "Would a lady this beautiful be left unchaperoned? Out here?" The question hung between them, more shocking than the thunder. Evelina blinked, water dripping from her lashes, certain she had heard him wrong. I beg your pardon." He swung his leg over the saddle, dropping to the ground with a heavy, graceful fluidity. He stopped 2 feet away, blocking the wind with his sheer size. "I asked why you are alone," he repeated, stepping closer. "In a storm, no less?" Evelina scrambled to her feet, clutching her crushed basket tight against her chest. "I'm looking for lavender," she whispered, feeling small next to him. "For my cousin." He looked at the wilted stems in her hand with disbelief, then back to her blue-tinged lips. His eyes narrowed dangerously. "You are risking your life," he said slowly, "for a weed." "It is for her complexion," Evelina defended weakly, though she knew how foolish it sounded. "She needs it for the Duke's arrival." The stranger went very still. His jaw tightened until a muscle ticked in his cheek. "For vanity," he growled. "She sent you into a gale for vanity." "She says beauty is pain," Evelina whispered, looking down at her muddy hem. "No," he snapped. "That isn't pain. That is sadism." He looked at her dress, soaked and clinging to her skin like tissue paper. The sight seemed to infuriate him more than the storm. "That is paper," he accused. "You are wearing paper." Evelina hugged her arms, trying to hide. "It is yellow muslin," she corrected. "It was a gift." "It was a death sentence," he muttered, reaching for his buttons. "Turn around." She stepped back until her spine hit the rough bark of the oak tree. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. He stripped the heavy coat from his shoulders. The scent of sandalwood and rain hit her instantly, warmer than any fire. "I am stopping you from dying for a bottle of face water," he said. "Turn around, or I will wrap you in this myself." She turned slowly. The weight of the coat hit her shoulders a second later, swallowing her whole. "Button it," he ordered from behind her. She looked down at her fingers. They were white and stiff, refusing to bend. "My hands," she whispered. "They won't work." He let out a sharp breath. Not of annoyance, but of frustration. He stepped around her, brushing her frozen fingers aside. "Move your hands," he murmured. He began to button the coat himself. He started at the bottom, working his way up. His head bent and his focus absolute. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Evelina," she breathed, watching the rain catch in his dark lashes. "Evelina," he tested the word, making it sound dark and rich. "And where is your chaperone, Evelina? Where is this cousin who needs to be beautiful so desperately?" "At the hall," she answered. "She's trying on her gowns." His hands paused at the top button, right at her throat. His knuckles grazed her skin, sending a jolt of heat through her. "She is trying on gowns," he repeated softly, looking into her eyes. "And you are in the mud." "It is my place," Evelina said simply. "Not anymore." He finished the button and stepped back. She looked ridiculous, drowning in his coat. but at least the shaking had stopped. "You are coming with me," he stated. Panic flared in her chest. She clutched the lapels of his coat. "I cannot go with a stranger," she argued. "I don't even know who you are." He looked at her, debating the truth. Finally, he decided on a half-truth. "I am Ambrose," he said. "Just Ambrose." "For tonight," he said. "Yes." He reached out and took the basket from her hand. Before she could protest, he tossed it into the brush. "My lavender," she cried. "Arabella will kill me." "Let her try," he snapped, catching her wrist. "Forget the lavender. You're coming to find a fire." He turned and walked back to the black stallion. He mounted it in one fluid motion, then reached a hand down to her. "Come here," he commanded. "I cannot ride," she insisted, planting her feet. "It is improper." Ambrose leaned down, his face inches from hers. The intensity in his eyes silenced her. "Look around you, Evelina," he said, low and rough. "The wolves in these woods do not care about propriety." He held out his hand. It was large, scarred and open. "Take my hand," he said. She looked at it. Then she reached up. He lifted her effortlessly, settling her sideways on the saddle before pulling her back against him. He was a solid wall of heat. "Hold the mane," he instructed, his arms encircling her to grab the reins. "I'm going to fall," she gasped as the horse shifted. "Lean back," he murmured against her hair, tightening his hold. "I will not let you fall." She obeyed, closing her eyes. "Better?" he asked. "Yes," she breathed. "Good." The stallion thundered down the muddy path, its hooves throwing up clods of wet earth. Evelina pressed herself harder against Ambrose's chest, seeking the only warmth in the screaming wind. "You are trembling," Ambrose shouted, his voice vibrating against her back. "I am freezing," she yelled over the gale, "and I am terrified." "Hold tighter, then." He shifted his grip, one arm locking around her waist like an iron band. "I have you, Evelina," he murmured, his mouth dangerously close to her ear. "I am not going to let you fall." "Where are we going?" she asked, squeezing her eyes shut against the rain. "The village is the other way." "The village is flooded," he answered grimly. "We are taking the high road across the bridge." Evelina's stomach dropped. She opened her eyes just as the trees broke away to reveal the roaring river. "Ambrose, stop!" she screamed. He pulled the reins hard. The great beast skid to a halt, snorting in the darkness as its hooves slid in the mud. "What is it?" Ambrose demanded. "Look," she whispered, pointing a shaking hand forward. Ambrose looked. The blood drained from his face. "My God," he swore softly. The stone bridge was gone. The river had risen, violent and black, swallowing the center arch whole. "It's gone," Evelina choked out. "The road is gone." "The current is too strong," Ambrose said, his voice tight. "If we had been a minute faster, we would have ridden straight into it." "How will I get back?" she asked, panic rising. "Arabella will lock the garden gate if I am late." "You are worried about a gate?" Ambrose asked, turning the horse sharply away from the edge. "Look at that water, Evelina. You aren't going back to Arabella tonight." "I must," she cried. "She is my guardian. She has the right to throw me out on the street." "Let her try," Ambrose snapped. He kicked the horse, forcing it up the steep bank toward the ridge. "Where are you taking me?" she gasped. "To the only roof left that doesn't leak," he said. "I cannot go to a stranger's house in the middle of the night," she argued. "My reputation." "Your reputation?" Ambrose laughed darkly. "Evelina, you are wearing a man's coat, covered in mud in a flood. Your reputation is the least of your problems." "It is all I have," she shot back. "Not anymore," he said. "Now you have me." The words hung in the air, heavy and possessive. They reached the top of the ridge. Blackwood Hall rose out of the mist like a fortress, lights glowing in every window. "That is the Duke's estate," Evelina breathed. "We cannot go there. They say he is a monster who hasn't smiled since the war." "He will make an exception," Ambrose said dryly. He rode straight up to the massive front portico. He didn't wait for a groom. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground, then reached up and pulled Evelina down into his arms. "I can walk," she protested. "Not in that mud," he said. He carried her up the stone steps and kicked the massive oak door with his boot. Thud, thud, thud. The door flew open. A stunned butler stood there. "Your Grace," the butler gasped. "We thought you were lost." Ambrose didn't stop. He marched right past the butler into the great hall, carrying Evelina as if she were a precious, fragile package. The warmth hit her like a physical blow. The room was vast, smelling of cedar and beeswax. A massive fire roared in the hearth. "Ambrose!" A voice floated down from the grand staircase. Evelina looked up. A tall, elegant woman with silver hair and diamonds at her throat was descending the stairs. She looked worried. "Ambrose, thank God," the woman said, rushing to the bottom step. "I heard the horse. I thought—" She stopped. Her eyes landed on the bundle in Ambrose's arms. She blinked. "Ambrose," she whispered, her eyes going wide. "Is that a girl?" Ambrose didn't lower Evelina. He held her tighter, daring the world to object. "This is Evelina, Mother," he said, his voice echoing in the silent hall. "The bridge is out. Is that a girl?" The Duchess repeated in a whispered, clutching the banister. Evelina froze in Ambrose's arms. She waited for the screech. She waited to be thrown out into the storm. Instead, a slow, brilliant smile spread across the older woman's face. She clasped her hands together as if she had just been given a pony. "You brought a girl home," the mother breathed, her eyes sparkling. "Henderson, do you see? He brought a girl home." "I see, Your Grace," the butler murmured, fighting a smile. "Put her down, you brute," the Duchess commanded, rushing down the remaining stairs. "Let me look at her." Ambrose sighed, a sound that rumbled deep in his chest against Evelina's ear. He reluctantly set her on her feet, though he kept a heavy hand on her waist to steady her. Evelina sank into a clumsy, terrified curtsy. Mud dripped from her hem onto the pristine marble. "Your Grace, I'm so sorry," she stammered, shivering. "I look like a scarecrow." "Oh, hush," the Duchess said, waving a dismissive hand. She grabbed Evelina's face in her warm, perfumed hands. "You are freezing, and you are beautiful. Look at those eyes, Ambrose. They are gold." "She needs a bath," Ambrose interrupted gruffly. "Not an inspection." Of course," the Duchess fluttered, turning on the servants. "Henderson, the blue room." Ambrose stiffened. "Mother, the blue room, Henderson," she repeated louder, "with the rose oil, and find her something of mine to wear, the silk robe." "Mother, the blue room is the mistress' suite," Ambrose argued, his voice low and dangerous. "It is next to mine." "It is the only room with a working fireplace," the Duchess lied smoothly. She didn't even blink. She winked at Evelina. "Besides, we want her to be comfortable, don't we?" "She's a guest," Ambrose warned. "Not a match. She is wearing your coat," the Duchess pointed out smugly, "and you carried her in like a precious package. I haven't seen you carry anything but a rifle in 5 years. Don't think I am blind, my son." Evelina looked between them. The panic was setting in. She tugged on Ambrose's wet sleeve. "Ambrose," she whispered. He looked down at her immediately, blocking out his mother. "You lied to me," she accused softly. "I omitted the truth," he corrected. "You are the Duke." "I am. And I just scolded you about your buttons." "You did." A small, crooked smile touched his lips, the first she had seen. It was refreshing. "I cannot stay here," she panicked. "Arabella!" "Arabella sent you into a storm for face tonic," the Duchess interrupted, hooking her arm through Evelina's. "She forfeits her rights. You are staying with us." "But, Evelina," Ambrose said. His voice cut through the noise. He stepped closer. "The bridge is gone. The river is a death trap. You are trapped with us." He reached out and tucked a wet strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her jaw. "Let my mother take care of you," he murmured. "I have to see to the horse. But I will be waiting for you at dinner." "You will?" she asked breathlessly. "Yes," he said, his eyes darkening. "I find I'm suddenly very hungry." He turned and strode back out into the storm, leaving Evelina standing in the warmth of the hall, her heart hammering against her ribs. An hour later, the blue room was silent, save for the crackling of the logs in the massive stone hearth. Evelina stood by the fire. She was clean now, her skin scrubbed pink, her hair drying in soft waves down her back. She wore the cream silk nightgown the Duchess had sent. It was exquisite, soft as water, with delicate lace cuffs that made her feel like a princess, not a pauper. There was a heavy knock at the door. "Come in," she called softly. The door opened. Ambrose stepped inside. He had changed. Gone was the muddy riding coat. He wore black trousers and a white linen shirt, the collar unbuttoned, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. He held a silver tray. He stopped dead when he saw her. The firelight caught the silk of her gown, illuminating the curve of her waist and the gold in her eyes. Ambrose stared. He didn't blink. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin, charged with a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. I brought your supper," he said. His voice was rougher than it had been downstairs. "You didn't have to," she whispered, pulling the silk robe tighter around herself. "The servants." "I sent them away," he said. He walked to the small table by the fire and set the tray down. The china clinked softly in the silence. As he straightened, he turned his head slightly. The firelight hit the left side of his face, the side he usually kept turned away from the world. Evelina gasped. She hadn't seen it in the dark woods. A scar, jagged, white and brutal, ran from his temple down to his jaw, disappearing into his shirt collar. It was a mark of violence, a mark of war. Ambrose saw her eyes widen. He flinched visibly. He turned his face away instantly, presenting his perfect profile to her, his jaw set in stone. "I should go," he said curtly, moving toward the door. "Eat the stew before it gets cold." "Ambrose, wait." Evelina took a step toward him. "Do not look at it," he warned, his back stiff. "It is not a sight for polite company." "I am not polite company," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "I am the girl you saved from the mud." He paused. His hand hovered over the door handle. "You don't want to see this, Evelina," he said quietly. "It frightens people. It is why I stay in the woods." "It doesn't frighten me." He turned slowly. He looked at her, challenging her, waiting for the disgust. Evelina didn't look away. She walked right up to him until she was standing inside his space. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and hovered her fingers inches from the scar on his cheek. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly. Ambrose stopped breathing. He looked at her fingers, then into her eyes. No one had touched him there in 5 years. "Only when I smile," he whispered. "Then it is a shame," she said, a brave, sad smile touching her own lips. "Because you have a beautiful smile." Ambrose made a low sound in his throat, half groan, half prayer. He reached out and caught her hand, pressing her palm flat against his unscarred cheek. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as if he was starving for it. "Evelina," he rasped. "Yes?" He opened his eyes. They were burning with a raw, terrifying intensity. "Eat your soup," he commanded softly. "Before I do something we will both regret." He let her go. He turned on his heel and walked out the door, closing it firmly between them. Evelina stood alone in the center of the room, her hand still warm from his skin. She realized with a jolt that she wasn't thinking about her cousin, or the lavender, or the scandal. She was thinking that for the first time in her life, she didn't want to be safe. She wanted to be with him. The storm had finally broken, leaving the village of Derbyshire glistening under a weak, watery sun. But 3 miles away, inside the damp cottage on the edge of the woods, the mood was thunderous. 2 days, Aunt Vance spat, pacing the small kitchen while the floorboards creaked beneath her feet. 2 days she has been gone, Arabella. Who is scrubbing the floors? Who is mending the linens? She has likely run off. Arabella sniffed, admiring her reflection in a cracked mirror. She probably drowned in the river. Good riddance. A sharp knock at the door made them both jump. A stable boy stood there, breathless, holding a sealed letter. He told them he had been paid a penny to run it down from the ridge. Aunt Vance snatched the letter and ripped the seal. "The nerve," she muttered, scanning the handwriting. "She says the bridge collapsed. She was trapped." Aunt Vance stopped. Her eyes bulged. Her hand flew to her throat. "Mother?" Arabella asked, bored. "What is it?" "She's at Blackwood Hall," Aunt Vance whispered, her voice trembling with greed. Arabella froze. "The hall? The Duke's estate?" "She says she has taken a fever," Aunt Vance read, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "She says the Duke gave her shelter. She's apologizing for not returning." Arabella snatched the letter, her face turning a mottled red. "She is in the Duke's house," she hissed, crushing the paper. "In his guest room, while I'm here in this hovel." "She is sick," Aunt Vance said, her mind working fast, "which means she cannot travel." The two women looked at each other. They didn't see a tragedy. They saw a golden ticket. "It is our duty," Aunt Vance declared, smoothing her apron. "We are her only family. We cannot leave her to suffer among strangers." "We must go to her," Arabella agreed, eyes gleaming. "To nurse her." "Get your blue silk, Arabella," Aunt Vance ordered, "and pinch your cheeks. We're going to visit a duke." Meanwhile, an hour later, the peace of Blackwood Hall was shattered by the screech of a hired carriage on the gravel drive. Ambrose stood in the great hall, his back stiff as he read a ledger by the fire. At his feet lay Barnaby, his massive Irish wolf hound. The dog usually slept 20 hours a day, but today his hackles were raised and his ears were pricked forward. The heavy doors groaned open. Henderson, the butler, looked pained as he announced, "Mrs. Vance and Miss Arabella, Your Grace." "The family." They didn't wait to be announced. They swept into the hall like a bad smell wrapped in cheap perfume. "Oh, Your Grace," Aunt Vance cried, rushing forward with a handkerchief pressed to dry eyes. "Thank heavens, we have been out of our minds with worry." Barnaby let out a single, deafening bark. It echoed off the stone walls like a gunshot. Aunt Vance jumped back, clutching her chest. "Good heavens! That beast!" "Barnaby," Ambrose said calmly, not looking up from his ledger. "Quiet. He is sensitive to pitch." "We came the moment we got her letter," Arabella said, stepping forward. She dropped into a curtsy so low it was almost comical, fluttering her eyelashes at the Duke. "My poor dear Evelina. Is she alive? Is she suffering?" Barnaby barked again, louder this time, staring directly at Arabella. Ambrose closed his ledger. He looked at the women. He saw the greed in their eyes. He saw the way Arabella was already assessing the value of the chandelier. "She is resting," Ambrose said coolly. "The fever is high." "We must see her," Aunt Vance insisted, recovering her composure. "We must tend to her. We love her like our own blood." Barnaby growled low in his throat, stepping in front of Ambrose as if to block them. "My dog seems to disagree, madam," Ambrose noted dryly. "He is clearly poorly trained," Arabella sniffed, "but we are here now to relieve you of the burden. Take us to her." Ambrose looked at them. He knew exactly what they were, but he also knew Evelina needed closure. "Very well," he said, his voice dropping to a temperature that could freeze water. "She is in the blue room, but I must warn you, she is fragile." "We will be gentle as lambs," Arabella lied. Upstairs in the blue room, Evelina lay in the massive four-poster bed, her skin burning. The fever had spiked in the night, leaving her weak and disoriented. The door banged open. "There she is." The voice cut through her headache like a knife. Evelina flinched, shrinking back against the silk pillows. Arabella and Aunt Vance marched in. They didn't look concerned. They looked annoyed that she was in such luxury. "Look at this," Arabella whispered to her mother, running a hand over the velvet curtains. "She lands in a palace while we rot in the cottage." "Evelina," Aunt Vance said loudly, marching to the bed, "you have caused us a great deal of trouble." I'm sorry, Aunt," Evelina rasped, her throat dry. "The storm always excuses," Arabella hissed. She sat on the edge of the bed, too close, blocking the light. "You did this on purpose, didn't you? You threw yourself at him." "No," Evelina whispered. "You little snake," Arabella smiled. "A cruel, tight thing. You think because he put you in a silk gown, he cares. He pities you. You look like a corpse." Arabella reached out. To anyone watching from the door, it looked like she was patting Evelina's arm comfortingly. But she wasn't patting. She found the tender spot where Evelina had bruised her arm in the fall 2 days ago, and she squeezed, hard. Evelina gasped, tears springing to her eyes. "Arabella, please." "Shh," Arabella cooed, digging her nails in. "Don't make a scene. You're going to get up, and you're going to tell the Duke you want to go home. Do you hear me?" "I can't," Evelina sobbed, trying to pull her arm away. "It hurts. You will stand, or I will—" "You will do what?" The voice came from the doorway. It was low, calm, and absolutely terrifying. Arabella froze. She snatched her hand back as if she had touched a hot coal. Ambrose was leaning against the doorframe. He hadn't made a sound entering. Barnaby stood beside him, a low rumble vibrating in the dog's chest. "Your Grace," Arabella squeaked, standing up quickly. "I was just checking her temperature. She's burning up." "Is that so?" Ambrose pushed off the doorframe and walked into the room. He moved slowly, like a predator stalking prey, until he stood right beside the bed. "Because from the doorway," Ambrose said, his eyes locking onto Arabella's face, "it looked like you were causing my guest pain." "Pain?" Aunt Vance laughed nervously from the corner. "Oh, Your Grace, you are mistaken. Arabella is a devoted nurse. She was just comforting her." Ambrose didn't look at the aunt. He looked down at Evelina. He saw the fresh tear track on her cheek. He saw the way she was cradling her arm against her chest. He reached out gently. "May I?" he asked Evelina. She nodded, trembling. Ambrose carefully lifted her sleeve. The bruise on her forearm was angry and purple, and right in the center there were 4 fresh white crescent marks where fingernails had dug in. The silence in the room was deafening. Ambrose lowered the sleeve with extreme care. He turned to Arabella. "You have a very aggressive way of checking a fever, Miss Arabella," he said. I didn't mean—" Arabella stammered, backing away. "She is delicate. She bruises like a peach." "And you squeeze like a vice," Ambrose countered. He stepped between Evelina and her family, becoming a wall of black wool and suppressed rage. "My lady," Ambrose said, his voice dripping with icy sarcasm, "I am under the impression that your presence here is doing the opposite of healing. In fact, Barnaby seems to think you are a threat." At the sound of his name, the huge dog stepped forward and barked, a deep, chest-rattling sound that made Arabella jump. "We only want what is best for her," Aunt Vance cried. "Excellent," Ambrose said. "Then you will agree that what is best is rest, absolute silence. Without you." He pointed to the door. "My mother is serving tea in the drawing room," Ambrose said. "I suggest you join her. I suggest you eat her scones. And I suggest, very strongly, that you do not step foot in this wing of the house again without my explicit permission." "But—" Arabella started. "Barnaby," Ambrose whispered. "Escort." The dog let out a snarl and took a step toward the women. Arabella and Aunt Vance turned and fled, their skirts swishing as they scrambled out of the room. Ambrose watched them go. He waited until their footsteps faded down the hall. Then, the anger drained out of his shoulders. He sat down on the edge of the bed. Gently. "Let me see," he murmured. Evelina held out her arm. "They hate me," she whispered, the tears finally falling. "They will never forgive me for this." "Let them hate you," Ambrose said, his thumb brushing lightly over her skin, avoiding the bruise. "As long as they do it from a distance." The door clicked shut, sealing out the world, the family, and their lies. The silence that followed was heavy as Ambrose turned back to the bed. He watched Evelina's chest rise and fall, his jaw tight with a fury that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the bruises on her arm. "Ambrose," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the fever. "I'm here," he said instantly. He reached for the basin of cool water on the nightstand and dipped a cloth. He wrung it out and pressed it gently to her burning forehead. "They are right," she mumbled, her eyes squeezing shut as the cool water hit her skin. "I'm a burden. You should have let me go back." "If you go back," Ambrose said, his voice low and rough, "they will kill you. Slowly, perhaps. But they will kill the light in you, and I will not allow that." "You hardly know me," she argued weakly. "I am just a stranger who ruined your coat." "You're not a stranger," he corrected. He moved the cloth to her neck, his knuckles brushing her pulse point. It was hammering, too fast, too hot. "Rest, Evelina," he commanded softly. "I can't," she gasped, tossing her head on the pillow as the room began to spin. "If I sleep, I might wake up back there, in the cold." "You will wake up here," he promised. "I am not leaving." She fought it for another hour, tossing and turning, tangling her legs in the silk sheets. Ambrose stayed in the velvet chair, wetting the cloth and holding her hand, anchoring her to the earth. But around midnight, the fever changed. She stopped thrashing and started to shiver violently. "Cold," she whimpered, her teeth chattering. "Ambrose, so cold." He checked the fire, which was roaring in the hearth. He piled another heavy quilt onto the bed. But it wasn't enough. The rattling sound of her breathing filled the quiet room. Ambrose made a decision. He kicked off his boots and removed his heavy black jacket, tossing it onto the floor. He climbed into the massive bed on top of the covers and pulled her shivering body against his side. "Ambrose," she breathed, delirious. "What are you doing?" "Sharing heat," he murmured. "Body heat is the only thing that breaks a chill like this." "Shh." He wrapped his arms around her, becoming a furnace of solid muscle and steady heartbeat. Evelina instinctively curled into him, burying her freezing face in the crook of his neck. She smelled of lavender and sickness, while he smelled of sandalwood and rain. "You stayed," she whispered against his skin. "I told you," he said, his lips brushing the top of her damp hair. "I am possessive." "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Because," he whispered into the darkness, a confession he would only make because he thought she wouldn't remember it. "Because for 5 years I have been dead, and when you fell at my feet in the mud, I took my first breath." Evelina shifted, tilting her head back to look at him. Her eyes were glassy and fever-bright as she searched his face in the shadows. "Ambrose," she whispered. She reached up, her hand cupping his scarred cheek, the side he hated. "Kiss me," she begged, "please, before I wake up and it's all a dream." Ambrose went still. Every instinct in him roared to take her, to devour her, but she was sick and vulnerable. "Evelina," he groaned, "you're burning up. You don't know what you're asking." "I do," she cried softly. "I want to know what it feels like, to be wanted." He couldn't resist. He leaned down, but he didn't kiss her mouth. That would be taking advantage. Instead, he pressed his lips to the corner of her mouth, just a breath away from a real kiss. It was soft, reverent, and heavy with a promise of what would come when she was well. "You are wanted," he whispered against her lips. "God, Evelina, you have no idea." He felt the tension leave her body. She let out a long, shuddering sigh, her hand sliding from his cheek to rest over his heart. "Okay," she whispered, her eyes fluttering shut. "Okay." Within minutes, her breathing evened out and the shivering stopped. The heat of his body had finally broken the chill. Ambrose didn't move. He lay there in the dark, holding the woman who had fallen from the sky, knowing that when the sun rose, the real war with her family and with his own demons would begin. But for tonight, she was his. It was 3 a.m. The storm outside had quieted to a soft drizzle, and the fire in the blue room had burned down to glowing embers. Ambrose was wide awake. He lay on his back, one arm numb because Evelina was fast asleep on it. She was curled into his side, her fever broken, her breathing deep and even. She had one hand resting flat over his heart, as if claiming him even in her sleep. He should leave. He knew that. Every gentlemanly instinct told him to get up, go to his own room, and save her reputation. But then he heard the floorboard creak in the hallway. Ambrose went still. He knew that creak. It was right outside the door. "I tell you, I heard a man's voice," Aunt Vance whispered from the corridor. Her voice was muffled by the heavy oak, but audible. "Mother, shh," Arabella hissed back. "If we catch them, we have leverage. Open it." Ambrose tightened his arm around Evelina. He prepared to roar at them. He prepared to tear the door off its hinges if they dared to disturb her rest. But before the handle could turn, another voice cut through the silence. Sharp, elegant, and terrifying. Mrs. Vance. It was his mother, the Dowager Duchess. There was a frantic shuffling sound in the hall. "Your Grace," Aunt Vance squeaked. We were just checking on our dear Evelina. We were worried about her fever." "At 3 a.m, the Dowager asked dryly, with your ear pressed to the keyhole? "We thought we heard noises," Arabella lied. "The only noise in this wing is my son's dog snoring," the Dowager lied right back, smooth as silk. "Now, I suggest you return to your guest rooms, unless you would prefer to sleep in the stables." "No, Your Grace. Of course not. Good night, ladies." Ambrose listened as his mother stood guard until the two women shuffled away, defeated. He let out a long breath. He looked down at Evelina. She hadn't stirred. She was warm, soft, and safe against him. He realized then that the morning would bring war. The aunt knew something was up. The cousin was jealous, and his mother was already running interference. If he left this room now, Evelina would wake up alone. The aunt would attack her. The world would try to tear her apart. Ambrose brushed a kiss against Evelina's temple. "Let them listen," he whispered into the darkness. "Let them plot. By noon tomorrow, you will be untouchable." He didn't sleep. He spent the rest of the night watching the firelight dance on her hair, planning exactly how he was going to destroy her enemies by making her his duchess. Sun flooded the blue room, turning the heavy velvet curtains to gold. Evelina stirred, blinking against the light, her hand instinctively reaching out across the sheets. They were warm, but empty. "I'm over here," a deep voice drawled. Evelina sat up, clutching the silk sheet to her chest. Ambrose was sitting in the velvet armchair by the fire, fully dressed in fresh linen and high boots, sipping a cup of coffee. He didn't look tired. He looked dangerously alert. "Good morning," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I trust you slept well. You steal the blankets, by the way." Evelina flushed pink. I'm so sorry. I should leave. My aunt." "Your aunt is currently downstairs in the breakfast room," Ambrose said, setting his cup down. "She's eating my toast and waiting for you to walk through that door so she can ruin you." Evelina went pale. "Ruin me?" "I spent the night in your bed, Evelina," Ambrose said calmly. "We both know nothing happened but sleep and warmth, but the world, and your aunt, will assume otherwise. If you leave this room as Miss Evelina, you are disgraced." "Then I must go," she whispered, swinging her legs out of bed. "I will pack my things and run before she sees me." "Sit down," Ambrose commanded softly. It wasn't a shout, but the authority in his voice made her freeze. He stood up and walked to the bed, sitting on the edge near her hip. "You are not running anywhere," he said, taking her hand. "There is a ball on Saturday. My mother has been planning it for months. The entire county is coming." "What does a ball have to do with this?" she asked, confused. "Everything," Ambrose smiled, a wicked glint in his blue eyes. "It would be a terrible shame to waste the champagne. So I have decided we shall use the occasion to announce our marriage." Evelina stared at him. "Our marriage?" "It is the only solution," Ambrose reasoned, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "If you walk into that ball as my wife, your aunt cannot touch you. No one can. You become untouchable." "But you don't want to marry me," Evelina argued, her heart pounding. "You are the Duke of Radcliffe. You want..." Someone perfect. Ambrose laughed, a low, genuine sound. He reached up and touched the scar on his own cheek. "Look at me, Evelina," he said quietly. "I'm far from perfect. I'm a scarred recluse with a loud dog and a meddling mother. If anyone is getting the short end of this deal, it is you." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Say yes," he urged. "Say yes, and we will turn Saturday's ball into a victory celebration. We will make your cousin green with envy, and we will make your aunt curtsy to you." Evelina looked at him. She saw the humor in his eyes, but underneath it, she saw the same solid protection she had felt in the storm. He wasn't just offering a title, he was offering a partnership. "A victory celebration?" she asked, a small smile tugging at her lips. "A complete rout of the enemy," Ambrose promised. "With cake." Evelina let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Okay," she whispered. "Yes." "Good," Ambrose said decisively. He stood up and pulled her hand, bringing her knuckles to his lips for a lingering kiss. "Now," he said, moving toward the bell pull, "I'm going to order breakfast for 2. And then I'm going to go downstairs and tell your aunt that she has exactly 1 hour to pack her bags, or I will let the dog chase her carriage all the way back to the village."
Ambrose pulled the velvet cord. A muffled chime sounded in the distance.
"Breakfast for 2, he told the maid who appeared at the door a moment later. "In here, and tell the stable master I need a rider for London immediately." The maid bobbed a curtsy, eyes wide, and vanished. 30 minutes later, they sat by the fire, a silver tray between them. Ambrose watched Evelina eat. She was hesitant at first, but the warm coffee and eggs brought the color back to her cheeks. "You have crumbs," he noted softly. Before she could wipe them away, he reached out and brushed a crumb from her lip with his thumb. The intimacy of it made the air in the room thick. "Stay here," he commanded gently, standing up and checking his pocket for the checkbook. "Do not open the door for anyone but me or my mother. I'm going downstairs to handle the dragons." "Ambrose," she said, looking worried. "My aunt. She has a sharp tongue." "I have a sharp checkbook," he replied with a dark smile. "I will be back before the coffee goes cold." Ambrose walked into the morning room downstairs. Aunt Vance and Arabella were seated at the table, halfway through a plate of scones. They looked up, expecting Evelina. Ambrose didn't sit. He didn't pick up a napkin. He stood at the head of the table, his hands clasped behind his back, looking down at them like they were bugs on a windshield. "Good morning, Your Grace," Aunt Vance chirped, nervously wiping crumbs from her mouth. "We were just wondering where Evelina is. We expected her to apologize for last night." "Evelina is breakfasting in her room," Ambrose said, his voice cool and clipped. "She's resting, and she will not be apologizing." "Resting?" Arabella scoffed. "Does she think she is the lady of the manor?" "As of Thursday," Ambrose said, "she will be." Aunt Vance choked on her tea. "Pardon?" "I have proposed," Ambrose stated. "We marry on Thursday." "But the banns," Aunt Vance sputtered. "You cannot marry in 3 days. It is illegal without the banns." "I have sent a rider for a special license," Ambrose countered smoothly. "The Archbishop is a close friend of my father's. He will not object." Ambrose flicked his wrist, sending the folded slip of paper sliding across the polished mahogany table. It spun to a halt right in front of Aunt Vance's butter plate. £500, Ambrose stated calmly. Aunt Vance froze. She looked down at the paper. Her hand reached out, trembling slightly, and she pulled it closer. 500. Her eyes widened. To the Duke, this was pocket change, the price of a new horse or a few cases of wine. But to Aunt Vance, who had spent her life turning old dresses and watering down the soup, it was a staggering amount. It was more money than her late husband had earned in 5 years. "It is enough to set you up comfortably in Bath," Ambrose noted, watching the greed flare in her eyes. "You could rent a proper house. You could buy new gowns." Aunt Vance stared at the check, mesmerizing by the ink. She licked her lips. "And all we must do is leave," she whispered, her voice tight. "Leave," Ambrose confirmed. "Now, and never darken my door or my wife's life again." Arabella leaned over, looking at the number. 500, she breathed, doing the math in her head. That was a lot of silk. That was a lot of bonnet ribbons. We have a deal, Aunt Vance said quickly.
Egg.
She didn't look at the empty chair where her niece usually sat. She didn't ask if Evelina would be okay. She snatched the check off the table and shoved it deep into her bodice, as if afraid he might change his mind. Come, Arabella, she said, her voice sharp with excitement. Go pack the trunks. Hurry, girl. We must catch the noon train. But I said move, Aunt Vance snapped. She stood up, gave the Duke a hasty, clumsy curtsy, and practically ran from the room. She didn't care about the wedding. She didn't care about the scandal. She had her money. Ambrose watched the door swing shut. He took a sip of his coffee, his expression filled with cold disgust. Cheap, he muttered to the empty room. She sold her own blood for £500. He stood up, turning his back on their retreating footsteps. Good riddance. Ambrose left the breakfast room, the echo of the front door closing behind the aunt still hanging in the air. He walked straight to the small, sunlit morning room where his mother handled her correspondence. Well, she asked, looking up from her desk. Did you handle them? They're gone, Ambrose said, closing the door firmly behind him. I gave them £500 and sent them to the train station. Good, his mother nodded, taking off her glasses. Cheap at the price. And Evelina? Evelina is staying, Ambrose said, walking to the window to avoid her gaze. I have sent a rider to London for a special license. We are to be married on Thursday. The room went silent, the ticking of the clock suddenly very loud. Thursday, his mother repeated slowly, not sounding excited. Ambrose, turn around. He turned. She was watching him with sharp, intelligent eyes. You have known the girl for 3 days, she said. I wanted you to court her, yes, but marriage? By Thursday, this is madness. It is necessary, Ambrose argued, his jaw tight. She spent the night in my room, Mother. If I do not marry her, she is ruined. I'm doing the honorable thing. Rubbish, the dowager snapped. Ambrose blinked. Pardon? Do not lie to me, she said, standing up and walking around the desk. You are the Duke of Radcliffe. You do not care about society's rules. You are marrying her because you want to. She stopped in front of him, looking up into his scarred face. Ambrose, listen to me, she said sternly. That girl is soft. She has a heart made of glass. If you marry her out of some misplaced sense of duty, or worse, pity, you will break her. I will not let you do that. Ambrose looked down at his mother. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. I do not pity her, he said quietly. Do you love her? She challenged. In 3 days. Love? Ambrose let out a short, harsh laugh. I do not know if I'm capable of the poetry you read in your novels, Mother. But I know this. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. When she is in the room, the noise stops. The anger, the guilt about Lenora, the constant need to hide my face. It all stops. She looks at me, and I feel human. He swallowed hard. I paid her family to leave because the thought of them taking her away made my blood run cold. I need her here. I need her to be safe. If that is not love, then it is the closest I will ever get. The Dowager Duchess studied his face. She saw the desperation he was trying to hide, and her expression softened. It is not poetry, Ambrose, she said gently, patting his arm, but it is a start. She sighed, a small smile touching her lips. Very well. If you are determined to do this, we must do it properly. You cannot marry a future duchess in a rush without a proper suit. I have suits, Ambrose grunted. You have black coats that make you look like an undertaker, she corrected briskly. I will handle the arrangements. You go and sit with her. And Ambrose? Yes. Be gentle with her, she warned. She is saving you just as much as you are saving her. The chapel was silent, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and old stone. Ambrose stood at the altar, his back rigid, listening to the soft rustle of silk approaching behind him. He turned. Evelina stood there, pale and trembling, looking less like a bride and more like a sacrifice. You look terrified, Ambrose noted, his voice low and rough. I feel like a fraud, she whispered, clutching her bouquet. Wearing your family's silk, taking a title I do not deserve. You deserve safety, he countered. Come here. He didn't wait for her to walk the last few steps. He closed the distance himself, taking her cold hand in his large, warm one. Your hand is freezing, he murmured, rubbing his thumb over her knuckles to warm them. You haven't touched me in 3 days, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. I thought perhaps you found me repulsing. Ambrose froze. His eyes darkened, a flash of genuine anger crossing his face, not at her, but at the idea. Repulsing, he repeated, stepping closer until he blocked out the light. I didn't touch you, Evelina, because you were vulnerable. You were under my roof, under my protection, with no one to defend you. He looked down at her, his expression fierce. If I had touched you then, I would have been no better than the men you fear. A gentleman does not take what cannot be freely given. Evelina looked up, her breath hitching. She realized then that his coldness had been a shield. And now? She asked softly. Now, Ambrose said, turning to the vicar, we make it legal, so I no longer have to be a gentleman. The vicar cleared his throat, looking nervous. If you're ready, Your Grace. Proceed, Ambrose commanded. The ceremony was a blur of ancient words. I, Ambrose, take thee, Evelina. He spoke the vows, not as a ritual, but as a binding contract. He slid the heavy gold ring onto her finger. It felt like a shackle, but a warm one. I, Evelina, take thee, Ambrose. She whispered her part, her voice shaking but clear. I now pronounce you man and wife, the vicar hurried to finish. You may... Ambrose didn't let him finish. He turned to her. The restraint of the last 3 days evaporated. My wife, he groaned. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. The look in his eyes was starving. Ambrose? She breathed. I am done waiting, he whispered against her lips. He kissed her. It wasn't a polite peck for the church. It was deep, hungry, and possessive. He kissed her like a man who had been dying of thirst and had finally found water. Evelina grasped his lapels to keep from falling, shocked by the sudden, overwhelming heat of him. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, his breathing heavy. Do you understand now? He asked, his voice a low rumble in his chest. It was never indifference, Evelina. It was torture. Evelina stared at him, her lips swollen, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. I understand, she whispered. Ambrose straightened, pulling her hand through the crook of his arm. He looked at the vicar, then back to the doors. Good, he said. Let us go home. The carriage rattled to a halt in front of Blackwood Hall, the grey light of afternoon fading into evening. Ambrose stepped out first, turning to offer his hand to his new duchess. Careful, he murmured, his grip firm. The stones are slick. Evelina stepped down, the weight of the gold ring on her finger feeling heavier than the silk dress. They walked up the steps, and the heavy oak doors swung open. Welcome home, Your Grace, the butler intoned. Ambrose didn't answer. He was looking at the massive grey shape uncurling from the rug by the fire. It was Barnaby, the Irish wolfhound, a beast of a dog that matched his master in size and temper. Barnaby, Ambrose warned low in his throat. Back! The dog ignored the command entirely. He trotted straight to Evelina, nudging her hand with a wet nose before leaning his entire heavy weight against her legs. Oh, Evelina gasped, steadying herself. Barnaby let out a long, loud sigh and thumped his tail against the floorboards. Evelina smiled, the first genuine smile of the day, and buried her fingers in his wiry fur. Hello to you too, she whispered. At least someone here is soft. Ambrose stiffened. He watched the dog, who usually growled at everyone, melt under her touch with a look of dark confusion. He does not usually like strangers, Ambrose noted. He knows I'm not a threat, Evelina said simply, scratching behind the dog's ears. He knows I'm just as overwhelmed as he is. Ambrose went very still. He stepped closer, and Barnaby reluctantly backed away to give them space. "Overwhelmed," Ambrose repeated. "By the dog?" "By you," Evelina admitted, looking up at him. "By everything." She took a breath, deciding to be brave. "You move so fast, Your Grace," she whispered. "You decide things, my dress, my family, my marriage, in the blink of an eye. You are like the storm that brought me here." Ambrose looked at her, his expression unreadable. "And you are afraid of the storm," he stated. "I am trying to learn how to stand in it," she corrected gently. "But it is a very strong wind to get used to." Ambrose looked at his hands, the hands that had just claimed her in the church, and then put them behind his back. He realized he had been galloping while she was still learning to walk. "I've lived alone a long time, Evelina," he said, his voice rough. "I have forgotten how to be quiet." He looked at the stairs, then back to her. "I will try to slow the wind," he promised. He offered her his arm, not touching her skin, but waiting for her to take it. "Shall we go up?" he asked. "You look exhausted." Evelina looked at his arm. It was thick with muscle, tense with restraint. She reached out and slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow. "I am," she whispered. "Then let us rest," Ambrose said. He led her toward the grand staircase. Barnaby followed close at Evelina's heels, a new guardian for the new mistress. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing out the hallway. The suite was massive, dominated by a four-poster bed draped in velvet, but Ambrose didn't look at it. He walked straight to a smaller door on the far wall, the connecting passage to his own private chambers. "My rooms are through here," he stated, his hand resting on the brass handle. "You will have total privacy." Evelina stood in the center of the room, feeling the sudden coldness of the space. "You are leaving?" she asked, her voice small. "I am giving you peace," he corrected, refusing to turn around. "I will lock this door from my side. You need rest, Evelina." He turned the handle, ready to vanish into his own world. Evelina looked at the empty bed, then at the broad back of the man who had saved her. "I do not want peace," she said clearly. Ambrose froze. The latch clicked, but the door didn't open. "Be careful, Evelina," he warned low in his throat. "Do not say things you do not mean." "We are married, Ambrose," she said, stepping closer. "If you lock that door, I'm not a wife. I'm just a guest in a silk dress." He turned slowly. His eyes were dark, burning with a hunger he had been suppressing for 3 days. "If I stay in this room," he said roughly, "I'm not going to sleep, and neither are you." "I know," she whispered, her face flushing. I do not want to sleep." He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides. The air in the room seemed to vanish. "Turn around," he commanded softly. "Why?" she breathed, looking up at him. "Because if I look at your face while I undo these buttons," he confessed, "I will rip the silk, and it is an heirloom." Evelina shivered. She turned her back to him, exposing the line of tiny pearl buttons running down her spine. "My hands are shaking," she whispered. "Mine are not," he murmured. His fingers brushed the nape of her neck, hot and calloused against her cool skin. He undid the first button with agonizing slowness. 1, he counted, his voice vibrating against her back. "There are 20, she whispered. "Then we have time," he said. He undid the second one, his knuckles grazing her spine. He bent his head and she felt his hot breath against her skin. "Ambrose," she gasped. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against her neck. "Tell me to go to my room and I will go." Evelina closed her eyes, leaning back against his solid chest. She made her choice. "Stay," she whispered. "Good," he groaned. His arms came around her, pulling her flush against him. The gentleman was gone. The husband had arrived. Saturday night arrived, bringing with it the roar of carriages and the heavy scent of perfume. Ambrose stood before the full-length mirror, fastening the heavy emerald necklace around Evelina's throat. "You are trembling," he murmured against her ear. "There are 300 people downstairs," Evelina whispered, looking at her reflection. The woman in the mirror wore gold silk and emeralds, but her eyes were still the eyes of the girl in the woods. "They will eat me alive." Ambrose turned her around, his hands heavy on her bare shoulders. "Let them try," he said darkly. "You are not their prey, Evelina. You are their queen." He offered his arm. "Ready?" he asked. Evelina took a deep breath, looking at the scar on his cheek that she kissed every morning. "Ready," she lied bravely. They walked down the grand staircase. The ballroom doors were closed, vibrating with the noise of the orchestra and the chatter of the ton. "Open them," Ambrose commanded the footman. The doors swung wide. The noise didn't stop immediately. The crowd was a sea of feathers and diamonds, swirling in a chaotic dance. But then someone saw the Duke. "Radcliffe is here," a voice hissed. Like a wave crashing, the attention shifted. The music seemed to fade as a group of young debutantes and ambitious mothers, the vultures, as Ambrose called them, spotted him. They didn't see the small woman at his side. They only saw the wealthy, elusive Duke. "Your Grace," Lady Sarah cried out, rushing forward with a fan fluttering like a hummingbird's wing. "Duke Radcliffe, you simply must dance with my daughter," another matron insisted, elbowing her way to the front. They swarmed him, a wall of silk and desperate ambition, ignoring Evelina entirely. She felt the old panic rise, the instinct to shrink back into the shadows where she belonged. Ambrose didn't move. He didn't smile. He simply raised one hand, palm out, and the wall of women froze as if hitting invisible glass. "Step back," he said. The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a whip. The women stumbled back, confused by the coldness in his eyes. They looked at him, and then, finally, they looked down at the hand resting possessively on his arm. They looked at Evelina. "Your Grace," Lady Sarah stammered, her eyes darting to the gold ring on Evelina's finger. We did not know you had brought a guest." Ambrose smiled then. It wasn't a nice smile. It was a smile of absolute victory. "Not a guest," he corrected, pulling Evelina forward until she stood in the center of the light. The room went deadly silent. Evelina lifted her chin, remembering the mud, the rain, and the man who had buttoned her coat. She squeezed his arm. "May I present?" Ambrose announced, his voice ringing to the rafters. "My wife, the Duchess of Radcliffe." He looked down at Evelina, ignoring the gasps and the dropped fans exploding around them. "Shall we dance, my love?" he asked softly. Evelina smiled, the fear vanishing as she looked into his frozen lake eyes. "We shall," she whispered. And as he led her onto the floor, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, bowing low to the girl who had survived the storm.